Let me introduce, let me introduce Dusty Alexander. He's our region manager for Hill Country, or I'm sorry, he's not ours. He's the region manager for Hill Country for the Plateau Land and Wildlife Management. And so the Plateau Land and Wildlife Management has been helping rural landowners protect and enhance their rural land since 1997. Plateau was born out of a law that was passed in 1995 by the Texas legislature that made it possible for landowners with an ag valuation to maintain their same property tax savings while managing for native habitat and wildlife instead of livestock, crops, timber, or any other open space management requirements. Plateau writes more wildlife management plans and service agreements than any other company in Texas. With more than 20 years of experience doing the right thing for landowners and their land guides our work. So Dusty Alexander, please take it away.
All right, thanks so much. Let's see here. I'm gonna go ahead and see if I can share my screen so I can get the PowerPoint going. And this is the one. All right. Is that working? Is that coming through okay? Perfect. All right, gang. So thanks so much for the intro. Thanks so much for having us. I'm going to do my best to keep this to right at an hour. It is an hour CE credit if you want it. And so we'll get rolling here. We got a little bit to cover. And so what I'm hoping to sort of accomplish today is it is going to be an introduction to the wildlife management valuation. And so we're not going to get too far into the weeds or the minutia in most cases here. But I want you guys to have a pretty good handle on what wildlife management is, you know, who could utilize it, what they would need to do to transition into it and then maintain it long term as well. And that way you guys can use it as a tool when you're working with landowners who are purchasing perhaps like ag land, but don't want to have anything to do with livestock or any sort of agricultural production. So we'll go through quite a bit of it. And like I said, when we get out of this thing, hopefully y'all have a pretty good handle on what it is. And we just want to be a resource for you folks. So you don't have to be the expert. You can just come to us and ask us the questions. All right, so for you guys as realtors, why should you guys care about wildlife management valuation? You know better than, you know, I'm preaching to the choir here, but there's so many folks these days purchasing land for recreational purposes, not necessarily wanting to continue with ag production, but they just want their country getaway perhaps, or a place to hunt or what have you. And they may not want to share their land with anybody, like a lessee to, you know, for cattle grazing or anything like that. But obviously they don't want their property taxes to go sky high if they cease ag production. And so they're just looking for a better way to maintain their ag exemption, maybe without cattle or goats or you know, timber or hay production, anything like that. And so this slide just does a good job of illustrating why it's good to hold on to that exemption. This is an actual 40-acre property in Kendall. And so market value, you'll see there, $650,000 right there where that property sits. It's about a 2% tax rate. And so this landowner's looking at $13,000 annual property taxes at market value. Okay. Now, if that property is appraised and gets an ag exemption, then basically what the appraisal district does is they come out, they appraise the property for what they can produce off the property in an ag product in any given year. So in this case, they decided that this property could produce $3,460 of ag product in a given year. Okay. And so the same 2% tax rate then moving forward is applied to this new value here, this 3460, as opposed to the 650,000. And so that's that's where the tax savings comes from. It's not necessarily an exemption from any taxes, because they're still paying the same 2% tax rate as everybody else. but it's on a different value or valuation of the property. All right. So when I call it an ag exemption or a wildlife exemption, because that term's burned into my brain from childhood, I'm actually wrong. It's not an exemption. It's a special valuation. It's an open space valuation. But you can see there their annual tax savings, $12,930.80. We don't want, you know, the landowner's not going to want to lose that savings, right? And so they have options of how they maintain that exemption. And so wildlife management could be a great option, a good fit for them. And landowners may choose wildlife management over traditional ag for any number of reasons. A lot of times it's personal preference. You know, maybe they just don't want to mess with livestock, with cattle, with pulling calves in the middle of the rainstorm, middle of the night, or what have you. Many times they don't want to maintain fencing or have to put up a bunch of new fences on a property. That can be costly. Now, you know, obviously that has nothing to do with neighbor management. That's up to them to decide what they want to do with their fencing there. But wildlife management valuation has no requirement on fencing and no limit to fencing either. If they want high fence, they can have it. Low fence, no fence, doesn't matter. So that can be a draw as well for some folks. It can just also wildlife management. A lot of folks these days are conservation minded, and so it's attractive to them. It can generally fit any budget, but it also leads to enhanced beauty and resale value of their land in most cases. And so, so it gives the landowner a lot of options. Livestock are allowed. You don't have to get rid of all of the livestock if they don't want to. Your valuation is based upon the primary use of the land, and so livestock could be a secondary use for a property that's large enough or has appropriate fencing, etc. Then livestock could be on the property and could even be used as a wildlife management tool, as long as the livestock are in the detriment to the wildlife management, and are obviously a secondary use. Then there's a great balance there that can be struck. The landowner gets to choose the native wildlife that they're going to focus on too. So they get to choose their target species and present that in a wildlife management plan based on, you know, what their goals are and what they're interested in, where their interests lie. They have, in order to maintain the wildlife exemption, they've got to perform a minimum of 3 wildlife management activities on the property each year. And there's 50+ activities that can qualify. And so they have a choice of a lot of activities, lots of freedom there. They can move back into ag if they ever want to. They don't have to reestablish any kind of ag history, anything like that. Wildlife management is just an alternative form of ag. You may also have a property that has great fencing on half and they want to keep cattle or goats or something, but maybe they've got a river that runs through and they can't keep fencing up on the other half or a portion of the property. You could put half that property that's dedicated to ag production in traditional ag and put the other half or portion of the property in wildlife management to maintain the exemption on that portion of the property. And so what is wildlife management? So like I said, it's just an alternative agricultural use. When somebody transitions from traditional ag production into wildlife, they're not transitioning out of ag, even though they may be transitioning out of ag production. Okay, but it's just an alternative ag use. That's why they can switch back and forth from traditional ag to wildlife. If ag becomes a better fit later on, they can go right into ag. They don't have to establish 5 years of ag use history, anything like that, without risking losing that exemption. The property does have to have a current ag valuation or open space valuation of some sort. So traditional ag production, timber production, things like that, before it can transition to wildlife management. So that's a prerequisite. The ag has to be in good standing before they can transition over to wildlife. The tax rate's going to stay the same. So that in that slide where we saw that 3460, the production value of the property, they're going to just move forward with that number after you've transitioned into wildlife management to calculate the taxes. So the property taxes will remain the same after you transition from ag to wildlife management. You do have to manage the property for native wildlife. So What we're talking about here are obviously the game species deer, turkey, quail, but also some other non-game species. Anything that's native to Texas and is considered wildlife is fair game. What we're not talking about here are like feral species like pigs, or exotic species like axis, cyca, things like that. If you've got a client who's into the exotics heavily, then exotic livestock may be a better exemption to look into for them. So there's 7 activity categories that those 50+ practices that I mentioned earlier will fall within. And like I said, to maintain the exemption, they've got to perform a minimum of 3 of those practices annually. Now, we recommend 4 or 5, and what we generally see is that folks that are going to be relatively active on their property, most likely planning on doing 5 or 6 of these things anyways. And we'll go through some of the more popular sort of activities so that you guys can kind of get an idea of what it could look like for your landowners, for your clients, for on their property, actually what they may be doing to maintain as opposed to feeding cattle or something like that. And so the tax code in the Constitution talks about, defines wildlife management, that the landowner must be actively using the land to propagate a sustaining, breeding, migrating, or wintering population of indigenous wild animals for human use, including food, medicine, or recreation. So the nice thing about this is the actively using the land. You've got to be active. It's not a get out of jail free card, but the nice thing about it is that it is activity based. It is not results based. So you don't have to show the county, look, I've got more deer, I've got more songbirds, et cetera, et cetera. They just have to show the county that they're doing their activities to promote those things. So show that they are, whether hog trapping is actually a great example of this. You may have hog trapping, or the landowner may have hog trapping as a predator control activity that they're doing for their wildlife management. All they've got to do is prove that they've got a hog trap baited and set on the property for a certain amount of time. They don't have to prove that they've actually caught anything in it. So the landowner just has to show that they're doing their part for that activity. If they do happen to catch something, that's even better. But it's all based on their activities. And so you do have to be focused on the breeding, migrating, wintering population of indigenous wild animals. Indigenous just means the natives, again, not exotics. And the fact that it is that is open to breeding, migrating, and wintering populations means that even migrators apply here. So dove, like white-winged dove, ducks, geese, things like that can be target species, even butterflies. Butterflies are a migrating native species. And so this was all brought about in 1995. Proposition 11 was passed by the majority of voters in Texas, decided to be a good idea to give folks this option. And it actually amended Article 8, Section 1D1 of the Constitution and brought about ag valuation for property and wildlife management. A little bit of the sort of why behind why this was pushed for in the beginning, trying to give folks another option to keep taxes low so that we can keep large tracts of land together as long as possible. So if cattle grazing no longer becomes an option for somebody and they've got to get rid of their herd, well, if they don't have some other way to hold the taxes down, their taxes are going to go sky high. And then they're looking at selling the land, most likely to a developer, or having to sell a portion of the land just to pay taxes. And so what we're trying to fight there is habitat fragmentation, and also looking to make better stewards out of landowners. And so by its nature, this program, the landowner has their wildlife management plan, and they also have to be performing their activities like we've been talking about. And so that's kind of the push behind trying to get some of this stuff passed, the motivation behind it in the first place. A couple of our founders are actually responsible for helping to push this through in the beginning. One of our founders is responsible for some of the verbiage that is in the Texas Constitution that brought this about, and our other founders sat on a bunch of the committees that came up with guidelines for this stuff. So Plateau has been in it since the beginning, since the early days. So it's been around for over 20 years. Right now, there's almost, you're getting up close to 4 million acres in wildlife management statewide. We help over 200 landowners each year, closer to 300 now, make the switch. So these landowners aren't alone. This is nothing new. even if they may be hearing about it for the first time, but they can rest easy. It's in the Constitution in the same place traditional ag is, and so it's just as solid as a traditional ag valuation or exemption is. So minimum acreage, it's an interesting topic, so we'll touch on it, but the short story here is that unless the property has reduced in size in the previous year, then there is no minimum acreage. Okay, just to sort of drive that home, reiterate that, we've got sub 5 acre properties that we've transitioned into wildlife management because they were currently in ag and they had not reduced in size in the previous year, and so they qualify. I will say that some counties are quirky about this, and if you have minimum acreage questions, if you have a smaller property that's looking at this, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We work with most of the counties in Texas, and so we generally know what their kind of general attitude is on minimum acreage. It's usually a misunderstanding because when minimum acreage does, if they have an issue with it, it's usually a misunderstanding, because minimum acreage, when it does come into play, like I said, is when the property was reduced in size in the previous year, and only if the property was reduced in size in the previous year. And so these numbers that you see here on this slide, that's where those come into play. Most of the Central Texas, most of the counties, it's 20 acres for a standalone property after it's been reduced in size. So an example of that is a large ranch that is broken up into ranchettes to sell. All right, as long as those properties are being broken out 20 acres or more in most of Central Texas, they still all qualify individually for wildlife management. But if they are less than 20 acres in most counties that we're dealing with around here, then they won't qualify that first year for wildlife management. However, they can maintain their ag some other way, maybe through community grazing lease in that ranch community, and then the following year they then have not been reduced in size since the previous year, and then they could qualify for wildlife management. So it's an interesting rule, and some counties interpret it interesting ways, but that in a nutshell is how it goes. Is if the property was not reduced in size since the previous year, then there is no minimum acreage. Okay. Now, I'm not telling you that if you've got 2 acres with a house on it, that's going to fly, because then it comes down to primary use. The primary use of that property is residence. And so, but if there's no house on there, we can talk. So we're going to go through some wildlife management activities so y'all can get kind of a picture of what it could look like for your clients to maintain, so that y'all have kind of an idea of whether or not this could be a good fit for them, a good option for them. And so, like I said before, there's 7 categories where all these 50+ activities, they're going to fall into 1 or sometimes 2 of these categories. And when I say you've got to complete a minimum of 3, you've got the landowner has to complete 3 separate categories. Okay, so they can do 1 activity in habitat control, 1 in predator control, and 1 in supplemental food, and that's 3, and that's good. What we don't want them to do is 2 habitat controls and 1 supplemental food and call it good, because that's only picking up 2 of these categories, and then you're going to need at least 3 categories. And you can do as many, the landowner can do as many of these activities as they want in as many. There's no top end limit. They could pick up all 7 categories, but 3 is the bare minimum. We recommend 4 or 5 just to give the landowners some breathing room. And the county is going to watch those 3 activity properties a lot closer than the 4 and 5 activity properties, just because the 3 activity properties only have to drop a single activity before they're below the minimum. The 4 and 5 activity properties will have to drop more activities before they're below the minimum, so that you stay further off their radar when you're more proactive, basically. And so we're going to walk through these, and I'll give you guys some of the more common examples of how folks are maintaining their wildlife exemptions moving forward. So first category here, habitat control, game population management. So if they're planning on hunting the property, that in and of itself is a wildlife management activity, okay? And usually comes along with some other things that could be considered wildlife management activities that we'll see through here. The other one that most folks that are buying hill country land, brush management. I don't know very many people that are buying land in the hill country that aren't going to cut some cedar, right? So that's a good one and usually fits in with most people's plans already. You know, and the brush management can be mechanical control of secondary growth cedar that can be accomplished with a machete, loppers, a chainsaw, or it can be a large project with, you know, hiring cedar eaters and having them come out and run their machines. But it doesn't have to be a big project, major clearing. Okay, it can just be maintaining open areas, keeping the small cedars beat back a little bit. So those are probably the two most common. The hunting and then the brush management, whether the management is mechanical. It can also be chemical control. If you've got somebody with the invasive species, they want to do some chemical control, spraying willow baccharis, or even spraying prickly pear, something like that. That can be brush management as well. Erosion control. So if you've got a property that has an existing tank on it, if that tank was completed when the property was in ag, that's an ag tank. Okay, it's not going to qualify as a wildlife management tank. But if they have to come in and do any sort of repair or maintenance after they've transitioned to wildlife, then that will qualify as erosion control for the next 10 years. So it'll be one of their 3 or 4 activities for the next 10 years after they maybe have to do some dam repair or scoop silt out of an existing tank, or obviously if they are building a new dirt tank on the property, that's going to be and it's going to be completed after they transition to wildlife. That's going to be an erosion control activity, and it's going to qualify for the next 10 years. And so that's a good one. All they've got to do for the next 10 years after they you know, repair or build a tank is just take a picture of it and basically monitor the tank and make sure it's still there doing its thing. But it can be a great activity, one that you don't have to do much after the initial investment there. There's other options: revegetation, dam construction, repair, we went over, but also things, anything that they're doing to slow the passing of water and dirt on and off their property can be an erosion control. It could be spreader dams, check dams, things like that, even low water crossings in some cases. So this can be a great activity. One that once they've done it, they don't have to worry about it much in the years to come. Predator control. So trapping, shooting pigs, hogs, feral cats, things like that. Great predator control activities. Imported red fire ants. This is one that a lot of folks are going to do anyways. If they're going to treat fire ants on the property, that can be predator control. Fire ants are a predator for any kind of a bird, especially ground nesting birds. But if you think of, you know, a bird nest with new babies in it, they've got their eyes closed, they don't hardly have any feathers, they're real susceptible to predation by fire ants. If fire ants get in there with those baby birds, they're going to clean that nest out. And so it can also be native predators like you see here, skunks and raccoons. The most common ones here are trapping or shooting pigs and treating fire ants. A lot of folks are going to be doing those things on their property anyways. So that's a great activity, usually pretty, or category, usually pretty easy for a landowner to pick up. Supplemental food. So they can put out feeders. That's the most common, and something to think about here long-term for your landowners really is how often do they want to refill their feeder. Minimum intensity on a feeder is 1 per 320 acres. So technically they could get away with a tiny little bird feeder on 300 acres and call it good. But if it's me, I'm going to be stressed out that that thing's empty all the time. And if they're a remote landowner, they might not get by there often enough to keep it full. So putting something like the picture on the left-hand side here, putting something out like this is essentially just a giant bird feeder, works well for wild birds, songbirds, turkey, dove, things like that. It's just a 250-pound gravity feed bird feeder is all it is. And so that gives them a lot of time between refills. They refill this thing, you know, maybe 5 or 6 times a year, and that's plenty. Take some good documentation of it, and they're golden. You know, there's a lot of other options. A lot of folks want to focus on white-tailed deer. We highly encourage a multiple target species in their wildlife plan. And this is a good illustration of one of the reasons why we recommend that. So if they want to get credit for supplemental food for feeding white-tailed deer, it's got to be free choice, and it's got to be at least 16% protein. A corn feeder, so corn is about 9% protein, and if it's on a timer, then we're dictating to the deer when they can come and eat, and so that's not technically free choice, and you're not meeting the protein requirements there. So technically, our beloved corn feeders are not supplemental food. It's a bait station, all right, for your hunting activities, your wildlife management, but it's not technically supplemental food for white-tailed deer. So if you wanted to get supplemental food credit for white-tailed deer, you could put up a gravity-fed, or your landowner could put up a gravity-fed protein feeder feeding pellets of at least 16% protein or better, but that's generally a lot more expensive to keep full than a bird feeder with wild bird seed. So it's just something for them to consider, moving forward, ease of maintenance and, the economy of the whole deal. And so, yeah, feeders are the most common by far here. Some people do food plots and things like that, but feeders are by far the most common in this category, supplemental food. Supplemental water. So if it's an old ag property, they may already have a trough, a bunch of troughs on the property for the livestock. And those troughs can be modified to be a little more friendly to small critters, small wildlife, by simply putting a ramp in, whether that ramp is made out of, cedar boughs or hog wire or rocks or whatever it might be. That can be a supplemental water activity, just keeping water in keeping those troughs active. It can also, they could also, maybe they don't have power, maybe they don't have, a water source on the property. It's just raw land. You could drop down like a wildlife rain collector, a guzzler that you see pictured here. This is one of our products, but it doesn't have to look like this. It can be built out of wood, metal like this. It can look a lot of different ways. There are even some nice rotomolded poly units that you can buy that are all self-contained to just drop out there on the ground or dig a hole and put them in the ground. But they're a great option if somebody's bought raw land that doesn't have a well on it yet, or just doesn't have access to water in a portion of the property maybe. This can be a great one. The rainwater collection can be. And if they happen to have a spring, they can do some development enhancement projects around that spring and get supplemental water credit. This is another 10-year activity, by the way, just like the erosion control, because water is important for the wildlife. So doing these things once will get them credit for that activity for over the next 10 years. They just need to continue to monitor to make sure they're functioning. Supplemental shelter. Some of the most common here are nest boxes and bat boxes. So folks don't mind or would enjoy putting up nest boxes. Like you see here, that's a chickadee box. You could also do most commonly wren, titmouse, chickadee, bluebird, but you can also do bat houses and purple martin houses can also be used, or owl shacks could also be used, wood duck boxes. There's a lot of options here, but very common nest boxes, basically because of ease of maintenance. Once you've got them up, it's just a matter of the landowner walking around their property once or twice a year to check on them, check on these nest boxes, and they'll just take a note, take a picture of whether or not that house is being used. And that's it. That's their wildlife management activity essentially for these nest boxes. Another good one, especially if they're going to be clearing some cedar or mesquite or something like that on the property, brush piles. So if they're going to be out there for a weekend doing some cedar cutting, they can throw that slash up into some brush piles, and that's two activities. They've got their habitat management, clearing the cedar, and then they've got supplemental shelter in those brush piles. All right. Maybe while they're out there, they check on their water and fill their feeders, and that's 4 activities in a weekend, right? So it doesn't have to be hard. It can be real easy for them. So the final category here is census activities. You can count the critters, basically count the wildlife. You can do spotlight counts. If you've got somebody that's doing heavy game management and they're doing helicopter counts, that qualifies. Or if they're doing some real good harvest records, that can qualify. But in some cases, it can even just be a landowner journal where they're kind of keeping track of the wildlife that they see on the property while they're there. That can be a census activity. And they don't have to hire biologists necessarily to do any of these. You can get good protocols for spotlight counts, camera counts, whistle counts for bob whites, covey counts for bob whites, all these things on text parcel walleye. And as long as they're following those protocols pretty well, they can do these censuses. Or you may have somebody who's a competent birder. Well, then they could do their own songbird survey, right? They could also hire us to help with a lot of that stuff, but nothing that we do necessitates the hiring. You know, we're just a professional service. The reason that folks use us is just peace of mind, basically. Same reason you may use a CPA to do your taxes, because this is what we do day in and day out. But they can certainly do all this stuff all on their own. So we'll talk about y'all's piece now, kind of selling the land that has these valuations on it. So thinking about your prospects here, qualifying them, thinking about what's their intended use of the land. Do they want to get into cattle? Do they want to get into goats? Do they not? You know, that kind of thing. Are they going to be hunting? Are they going to be living there? It's something to think about. You know, a lot of times wildlife management is a great fit for remote landowners, for folks that aren't living on the property, just because they can get most of their activities done in a handful of weekends out of the year for wildlife management, and they don't have to be checking on livestock every day. You know, a lot of times having livestock present means they've got to be monitored every day, unless, you know, if they have a lease agreement with somebody, then usually the leasee is going to be doing the one checking. But a lot of folks also don't want someone else having access to their property necessarily for checking on their livestock, or they just don't want their property to be grazed down to the point where it looks like, you know, a floor with some cow patties on it, nice and smooth. But these are all considerations. You know, how far do they live from the property is similar to whether or not they're going to live there. You know, if they live in another state, especially, then wildlife management may be a great fit for them. They can, like I said, get their activities done handful of weekends out of the year, or they can hire somebody to take care of their activities for them, somebody local or a firm like us, perhaps. And you may have run into some buyers too who are just conservation minded, and they're far more interested in being a very good steward of that land and committing to that long term than they are in the livestock production side of things. And so these are all generally good candidates for wildlife management being a good fit. And so it's a good idea for folks to consult with a professional biologist from the stand, just so that they have a firm foundation. Like I said, they can do their own plan writing. Most of the folks that I visit with that have done their own plan wish they would have hired somebody to do it from the get-go, because they learn that it could have been much easier in the long run to maintain had they known sort of all the ins and outs of the guidelines, minimum intensities and things. And it could have been much cheaper to maintain. You know, and just some small things like choosing a variety of target species. A lot of folks will just jump in and pick deer, or just pick turkey, or just a single species, and they're just pigeonholing themselves from the beginning into a smaller set of potential activities that qualify, right? And so just having a quality plan just makes it a lot easier to maintain. And so it's a great idea for them to consult with a biologist. Although, like I said, they don't have to. If they've got the time and the motivation, they can sit down, read the guidelines. And I will happily, if you have somebody that wants to go their own route, you can send them to me, and I'll show them where the forms are, where the guidelines are, everything they're going to need to fill it out themselves. 9 times out of 10, they'll go through, look through the guidelines, and then they'll come back and say, okay, never mind. I don't want to do this. It's too much of a pain. But happy to help when people are motivated to do it. So the application process, the filing window, if you will, every year, January 1st to April 30th. Okay. That's a state mandated filing window. Sometimes the counties, they will request other dates, earlier due dates, perhaps, on the applications, annual reports, things like that. And when what we tell landowners is, when you can comply with those earlier requested dates, absolutely do it. There's no reason to poke the bear. But if for some reason you cannot, then April 30th is the state mandated deadline. They can't reject your application. And actually, you can even file late. But April 30th is the state mandated filing deadline. And then, so they've got to turn in a written wildlife management plan along with a 1D1 application. The 1D1 application is the exact same one that you would use for cattle or goats or any ag production. Instead of cattle grazing, goat grazing, they would put wildlife management on there, and that accompanied with the wildlife plan are the pieces of paper that are needed to go into the appraisal district to take care of that. It's a good idea to have documentation of any activities that are already going on or previous activities as far as your ag history goes. For new owners, generally this isn't as big of a deal. They're given the benefit of the doubt. If they bought the property in ag, then generally the county is not going to ask them to prove that there was ag activity going on. But if you have a, if you're working with somebody and 5 years, they buy a property, they apply for the ag and they get it, and 5 years down the road they want to transition to wildlife, it's a real good idea for them to be able to prove 5 out of the last 7 years of ag use. And if they can't, that can be a problem. So documentation. This also, interestingly enough, during this COVID-19 stuff, we're seeing this come up more. The counties don't want to go out and see the property, and so they're asking for more documentation of pictures, things like that, of the wildlife activities that these folks have set up in the year that they have applied. And so we also see other counties who are just accepting in year 1, and then year 2 they'll come out and take a look around to give them an opportunity to get their activities rolling and things like that. But yeah, the things that they need to know for applying, if they need to apply before April 30th in the year after they close. So if you have a property that closes in this year, 2020, they don't need to apply for ag or wildlife until before April 30th, 2021. Okay. And so as long as they've got their application in before April 30th the following year, they're in great shape. It's a good idea to make sure they have some activity going on the property for this year, even if they are quote unquote covered by the previous ag use. But that's just to show proactivity, really. Looks good to the county, good faith effort. And so for you guys, using wildlife management as a closing tool, if you've got a traditional ag property that's got cattle on it and you've got a potential buyer where it's a good fit otherwise, they could transition it to wildlife management after they purchase it and get rid of the cattle. It gives you more options. Basically, it keeps the favorable tax value. It keeps their taxes low, keeps that exemption in place. It takes the place of the cattle or the goats or the hay production or whatever it might be that they might not want to bite into, might not want to get into. In most cases, it's going to be less cost and less work than a traditional agricultural activity. The exception to that rule is if you've got a real good cattle lease or something like that going on. If you've got a great tenant, then that can be, and it fits the property well, fits the habitat well, then by all means, that ag may be a great fit for them. But with wildlife, there's, like I said, there's no fencing requirements. So if they have issues, if the property has issues with the fencing and the new buyer's not ready to throw a bunch of money and putting a bunch of new fences up yet, they could transition it to wildlife while they're doing the fencing. Gives them several years or as many years as they want, really, to get that fencing up and running, and then they can transition it back and bring cattle out if that's what they'd like. Decrease liability. So if there's no livestock there to get out and get onto a highway and get hit or destroy the neighbor's, wellhead or whatever it might be, then they're not liable for that destruction and damage and death and all that good stuff. So the landowner that owns, that has cattle, if they get out and cause damage, they are liable for that. If they transition to wildlife and they get rid of their livestock, then that liability goes away. Let's see, removes the fear of rollback. So that just meaning if you have somebody that buys an ag property and they let that ag exemption go, they don't transition it to wildlife, they don't apply for any type of exemption moving forward, then they are subject to, the county can charge them rollback taxes. And so they'll get hit with a pretty big, pretty hefty bill on their first tax bill. And so at this point, that's 3 years back. That changed not too long ago. It used to be 5 years back of rollback, and now it's 3 years. And I can't remember the percentage anymore, but it's gone down as well. But it still can be significant, and not something you want to mess with. And taxes are just continuing to go up pretty much across the board. So it's a good idea to hold on to that exemption by transition to wildlife if that's a good fit. So how we can help you folks. We just want to be a good resource really for you and your clients. If you come across a county that tells you something that kind of raises an eyebrow, sounds off, sounds weird, or if your county just says, no, you can't do that, it's usually a good idea to give us a shout. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know all there is to know about this stuff, but I work with some real smart folks, a lot of biologists and property tax consultants. And so we'll get you good info. And we've had relationships with a lot of these counties for a long time too. And so we kind of know their quirks and know where we can push them and where we can, protest, things like that. But, we don't want you guys to have to become experts on wildlife management. You've got enough on your plate. And so, we want to be a resource for you. You can hand your client our card and know that they're going to get good information and good service if they decide they want service from us. That's really, in a nutshell, that's our goal, is to be able to be a resource for you folks. And y'all can, like I said, y'all don't have to be the end all be all on wildlife management exemptions for your clients. You can let us help you with that. And so that is pretty much it. Let me see if I can pop open the chat here to see if we had any questions pop up while I was going through. Let's see. Nope, I don't see any questions. Does anybody have any questions? I don't know. We can either do them through the chat or you can unmute and just ask if you have any questions at all over wildlife management valuation, what it takes, all that good stuff.
I don't see any questions in the chat section, but Candy Cargill and